Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Hosting Mason Bee virtual event. We're so excited to be here with all of you this morning. We have a record attendance for this virtual event with over 487 people registered as of this morning. So we're really excited to share our event with you this morning. I'd first like to acknowledge the resiliency of Indigenous peoples and that no matter where you're tuning in from today, you are on Native land. Before I introduce our program, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll be able to use the Q&A box or the chat feature, both found on your Zoom control panel, to submit questions to today's presenters. At the end of our presentation, we will have a Q&A session and we will try to get to as many questions as we can, but we will be recording the questions and answer any remaining ones in a post-event email in the coming weeks. As time allows, our presenters will address as many questions as we can. Getting us started today is our Conservation Director, Dan Roix. Dan has worked for Columbia Land Trust since 2008 and has served in his role since 2016. As Conservation Director, Dan leads the Land Trust Protection Program as it works to protect high priority natural areas, support urban residents in renaturing their yards, and find new ways to connect people to nature and conservation. Dan currently serves on the board as the board president of the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts and views a collaborative approach to conservation as key for caring for the nature of the Northwest. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Tanya. Hi, everybody. As Tanya said, I'm Dan Roix. I've had the privilege of working for Columbia Land Trust for the past 13 years, and it's great to be here with all of you this morning. Before we jump into Mason Bees, I want to just go over quickly a little background about the Land Trust and the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. So the Land Trust has been around for over 30 years, working to conserve and care for the vital lands, waters, and wildlife of the Columbia River region. Using the best available science and building strong partnerships is key to our work. We work across a large region, covering essentially the lower 250 miles of the Columbia River in both Oregon and Washington. And over the past 30 years, we've conserved over 50,000 acres of land. One thing that's really interesting about our region is the ecological diversity of it. Spanning that 250-mile stretch, there are 5 different distinct ecoregions. If you think about starting on the coast, out near Astoria or on the Long Beach Peninsula, you're in a rainforest getting over 80 inches of rain a year, lush forest, a wide estuary with tidal wetlands and floodplains. And as you move east across our region, you come over the Coast Range and then down into the Willamette Valley and Puget Trough, rich with fertile farmland and also the urban centers of our region of Portland, Vancouver, and the surrounding areas. And you keep moving east up into the Cascades and the West Cascades, dominated by Douglas fir trees and large swaths of national forest and industrial timberlands. And you come over the crest of the Cascades and everything changes really rapidly. You end into a rain shadow and the rainfall levels start dropping really fast. And so suddenly you're in a ponderosa pine and then oak woodland. And that through that narrow band of, as you see on this map, the East Cascades, an incredible transition happens from the wet forests of the West Cascades to the dry oak woodland, and then spreading out into oak savanna and eventually the high desert of the Columbia Plateau. And one of the things that I enjoy most about conservation work in this region and getting to live in Portland and work throughout this region is an hour and a half drive in either direction. I'm either at a rainforest getting over 80 inches of rain a year, or out in the Dalles and into the Columbia Plateau. The Dalles gets about 18 inches of rain a year. You keep going east from there, that rainfall continues to drop out. So it's really a remarkable area, rich in biodiversity, and it's for me just fun to get to explore that, to get to work on conservation throughout that. Right in the center of this, though, the Portland, Vancouver metropolitan area, the largest urban areas within our region, and home to the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. The Backyard Habitat program works with landowners and area residents. I imagine a lot of you on this call are probably participants in the program. The program supports area residents in bringing nature into their yards. It's a partnership between Columbia Land Trust and Portland Audubon, and there's also a large number of other partners involved. Specifically, the Watershed Alliance of Southwest Washington was key to us bringing the program to Clark County, Washington. We were able to do that a couple of years ago. Friends of Tryon Creek has been a great partner for us in delivering the program in areas of Clackamas and Washington County. And we have community partners and partnership projects that are continuing to grow and emerge. We have great programs working with Verde, Apano, and Centro Cultural to figure out how to deliver the benefits of the program to people throughout our entire region. It's also worth noting, not shown here on the slide, we have funding partners and agency partners throughout the area, a lot of cities and counties supporting the program and view it as a way to help serve their residents. Just want to highlight kind of a little bit of the focus of the program. There's 5 key elements to the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. You see on the slide here: removing aggressive weeds, bringing native plants into people's yards, reducing and eliminating pesticide use, providing wildlife stewardship, and managing stormwater on site. In addition to these 5, we're also actively working on figuring out ways that we can more fully integrate climate action into the program. A lot of those 5 elements provide climate resiliency benefits for our urban area. They make us better suited to adapt as the climate changes. And we're just constantly thinking about how the program also needs to adapt and change in the face of the climate change we're facing. Just a quick highlight kind of how the program works for those of you who haven't participated in it. You sign up, register with the program, pay a nominal fee, and for that you get a technician visit out on your property. They walk your property. Pre-COVID times, they walk it with you. Right now, we're doing a socially distanced version of this, but we're still able to deliver the program. The technicians help you understand what plants are in your yard. If you don't already know, they can help identify native plants that are already there and help identify weed species that are problematic for native wildlife habitat and that choke out other native plants. And they essentially set you on a journey to help figure out a plan for your yard. Some people sign up for the program and already have lots of native plants and just want to get some of the incentives that come with it, some of the connections that come with it. Other people need help developing a plan for how to bring more native plants into the yard. I know for me, I knew some things about my yard, but the technician visit was really crucial to helping understand what native plants would do well in what parts of my yard. Before we move on to Mason Bee's and Janet's presentation, I just want to touch on something that for me is the most exciting part of the Backyard Habitat Certification Program, and that's the connections that come out of it. And those connections are, neighbor to neighbor, people who see signs in each other's yard and build relationships and start talking about native plants and about ways we can all work together to support conservation. And also the connections that happen for wildlife, for bird species that are traveling in and out of the urban areas. I want to highlight just three Columbia Land Trust conservation properties that benefit from the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. So going back out to the East Cascades, our Four Sisters property near the Dalles is beautiful wild flower meadow, rich with native plants, amazing pollinator habitat. And every year birds travel from this property and for the next one we'll show on Mill Creek Ridge. They travel from this property through the gorge, through our urban area, and benefit from urban wildlife habitat and benefit from these protected natural places as well. So here's another example of an amazing wildflower meadow, great pollinator habitat on the East Cascades, in the East Cascades. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on emerging pollinator habitat. We're working on restoration along the Tualatin River at 2 sites just south of the urban growth boundary. So these are properties that that over the coming years will become restored wet meadows. And I look forward to hopefully starting even next year, being able to do some tours with a number of you on this call, where we can look at backyard habitat sites in Washington County and drive, less than a mile in some cases to a wet prairie restoration site and think about strategies that work at a less than 1 acre scale in someone's yard and also work at a 200-acre scale on a large scale restoration project. So just lastly, I just want to kind of leave you with this image of our urban areas. It's been remarkable to get to see the growth of this program over the last decade. And we are now at 7,400 properties, 7,400 participants in this program, which translates to 1,800 acres of land being restored within our urban area for native wildlife, for pollinators, for bird species. And it's really remarkable what we're all doing together. So to those of you that are in the program and are participating now, thank you for your work. You are doing important conservation work in your yards, and hopefully you're having fun and learning a lot as you're doing it as well. So let's get on to the topic of the day, mason bees. It's a privilege to introduce Janet Gifford. She is a Land Trust board member and Backyard Habitat Certification Program volunteer. Janet has hosted mason bees for 11 years and is a knowledgeable resource on best practices for supporting these native pollinators. Through Janet's presenting of workshops on this topic for the Backyard Habitat Certification Program and other community organizations, hundreds of people have learned how to take steps to strengthen the native bee population and to help restore the landscape. Thanks to Janet, many workshop participants are now hosting mason bees where they live. And hopefully after today, many more will join in that as well. Thanks, Janet. Take it away.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everyone. Based on today's workshop and the high degree of interest, this is going to be a very good year for mason bees, I can tell. I raise mason bees because I want to help strengthen the population of native pollinators. You might be interested in raising mason bees because you increase the yields of the bees that grow or fruits and vegetables in your garden. Very good reason. They are crucial to our life support on Earth. 1 out of 3 bites of food that we enjoy is pollinated by bees. Pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grains from the male anther of the flower to the female stigma of the flower, is the process conducted by pollinators upon which 1/3 of our diet depends. Mason bees emerge in March and or April in the Pacific Northwest before many other species of bees have emerged to pollinate. It makes them then pollinators for the spring bloom fruit trees, the berry crops, and many other native plants of the region. Native bees and native plants have evolved together over millions of years in the region, and they are in sync with one another. Mason bees are champion pollinators. Mason bees will pollinate 95% of the flowers they visit. The honeybees that pollinate about 5% of the flowers that they visit. As an example, 2 to 4 mason bees can pollinate one entire mature fruit tree in blossom, where it would take about 120 to 300 honeybees to pollinate that tree. Mason beekeeping does not require protective clothing or expensive equipment. All ages may participate. My great niece and nephew began hosting mason bees when they were 9 and 12 years of age, respectively. Danger is almost non-existent. The risks are low and the rewards are high as we help support food sources for humans and for wildlife. Before honeybees were imported to North America from Europe, the native mason bees were doing much of the pollinating. let me say that you don't need to have a garden in order to host mason bees. You may have an opportunity where you live near to a park or you live near to a natural area. And so the mason bee opportunity is yours as well. Now, when you first meet your mason bees, they're going to look like fuzzy, plump raisins. So what I would like to share with you are some of the descriptions of what they'll look like when you actually see them in the garden. Mason bees are shiny and iridescent. In the Pacific Northwest, the mason bee that native to our region is the Osmia lignaria bee. The Osmia bees live throughout the world in the temperate zones, and the Osmia lignaria is shiny and iridescent, green to blue-black. You'll see in the slide an appearance of a mason bee of the Pacific Northwest. Slightly smaller than the Osmia lignaria bee is a bee that some people mistake for a housefly. The mason bees will pollinate most of the blooming plants in the garden during their short lifespan. They are pollinating for between 6 to 8 weeks in the spring. They are attracted to pollinate native plants as well as ornamental plants. Practically anything that's in bloom will attract their interest. The mason bee has a perfect pollinator body. The female bee will belly flop into the flowers and then move from flower to flower in a zigzag pattern, collecting pollen and nectar as she goes. The pollen is carried on the abdomen hairs, and then they will fall off on each flower as she zigs and zags across the flowers. Mason bees do not make honey, but they make healthy trees and shrubs, more plentiful flowers, fruits, berries, and vegetables. Now, honeybees will fly about 4 miles to find their preferred food source. Mason bees will limit their pollination work to within 300 feet of their house. Another mason bee, which is commonly seen in the Willamette Valley and in the Portland area, is the Osmia cornifrons. This is a naturalized mason bee, not native. This bee was introduced by the United States Department of Agriculture decades ago to pollinate orchards in the Willamette Valley. This mason bee is brown with light stripes on its body. The name mason comes from the skill of building chambers out of mud for their offspring. Each female mason bee is her own queen. She takes on the responsibility of creating a life support system for each egg that she lays. She has no hive to protect, and the next generation is safely out of harm's way in their cozy mud chambers. Mason bees are solitary bees, as are 90% of all native bees. And mason bees are also gregarious bees. They like to live in the vicinity of other bees. Each mason bee does her own work, and they don't bother one another or others in the colony. Mason bees share the meadows and the woodlands and the gardens with many other types of native bees and with honeybees, and they do not bother one another. The mason bee life cycle is a 12-month life cycle, and the mason bees need morning sunlight, open blooms, and nearby clay-like soil to bring to their nest. To responsibly host mason bees, we need to understand their year-round needs. So let me just quickly describe that for you. By mid-March to early April, in the valleys of Western Oregon and Washington, and a little later in the higher elevation and more inland areas, when the outdoor daily temperatures consistently reach 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be 10 to 13 Celsius. And blossoms are opening on trees and shrubs. If the mason bees in their cocoons are positioned to feel the warmth of the morning sun, they will chew out of their cocoons and take flight. We can follow their life cycle by looking at a chart that we have for you. The mason bee life cycle begins with emergence, beginning at number 1 and moving clockwise through emergence, mating, egg laying, larva development, metamorphosis into cocoons, hibernation as an adult bee in cocoon, and then emergence by the next generation in the following spring. In 2020, I recorded the emergence of male mason bees and female mason bees at the habitat in Portland, where I live. On March 28th, the male bees emerged and began to emerge, and on April 4th, the female bees began to emerge. A neighbor noticed bees at his mason bee house emerging on April 5th. From the egg to the larval stage takes about 11 days, and then from the larva to the cocoon occurs in another 32 days. So during this month and a half of development, from the emergence through the mating, the egg laying, and the larval development, pollination is occurring within 300 feet of the mason bee house. All types of plants in bloom at that time are being pollinated. The female bees die after about 6 to 8 weeks of emergence. And then the next generation of bees develops by resting in the mud chambers that the mother bee left behind through the fall and winter months. And then they emerge, the next generation emerges the following spring. It's often asked of me, how does the egg, the larva, and the cocoon, how is their nourishment provided? And what is going on is that during the pollination by the female bees and the laying of the eggs in the mud chambers, the female bee is bringing a pollen and nectar ball, some people call that bee bread, into the nest so that that is nourishing the offspring while it's in its developmental stage. A female bee can lay in her lifespan up to about 35 eggs in the lifespan. And that would equate to about 2 or 3 tubes or tunnels in a mason bee house. Now let's consider the 4 essentials that mason bees need for their life support. And when you're hosting mason bees, you want to consider all 4 of these essentials. The first would be the plants in the landscape where the mason bee house is located. That might be your garden, that might be your neighborhood, that might be your apartment, balcony, park. You want to be thinking about the plants that are in the vicinity of where the mason bee house is. Blooming plants bloom March until June. The plants being so essential, trees and shrubs primarily because of the large number of blossoms. You see on this slide a number of native plants that are now native to the Pacific Northwest region. Wherever you live, you want to be thinking about plants that are native to your region as being very important for the ecosystem and important for the pollination by mason bees. There's growing evidence that our native bees prefer native flowers to non-native flowers. Kind of makes sense since the native bees and the native plants have evolved together over millions of years. Research conducted by Professor Douglas Ptolemy, who is professor of entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware, showed that the native bees preferred to pollinate the native flowers. They took plants of the same genus, as an example, the ribes. Ribes we know as currant. Here in the Pacific Northwest, two local native varieties of the currant are the red flowering currant, Ribes sanguineum, and the golden currant, Ribes aureum. In their research, they took those native plants and then non-native plants of that same genus, so a non-native or ornamental currant. And then they studied how the native bees were attracted. Well, the native bees showed a statistical preference for native flowers in 31 comparisons, and they never showed a preference for the non-native or alien flowers. Now, that's not to say that they won't pollinate the non-native flowers in the garden, but it does suggest that there is a preference on the part of the native bees and that they are very attracted to the native plants in bloom. You also want to consider a progression of bloom. Since the mason bees are living March until June, think about the plants that are in bloom over that progression of months. You want to think about the trees and the shrubs as examples of the vine maple, the big leaf maple, the serviceberry, Oregon grape, the red flowering currant, the golden currant, and many other plants that are native to the region. And then think about perennials and fruits and vegetables and ornamental plants that also are blooming in that same time. To get a bee's eye view of the area where you're going to put up your mason bee house, walk through the area and make notes of the plants that are in bloom each week. And what gardeners love almost as much as life itself is to add plants to the garden. And so think about how you could add plants to this garden area or natural area that you're planning to, where you're planning to host mason bees. Some native plants in particular that would be beneficial for the native pollinators and for the native songbirds that frequent this area. We will provide a link after the workshop to a helpful resource for native plants. The second essential ingredient, very important for mason bees' survival, is mud. Mason bees need to have wet clay soil within 50 to 100 feet from their house. The female bee looks for moist clay-like soil in which she will carry back to the nest in her mandibles, as the photo is showing, a female bee carrying mud. Look around on a rainy day and notice where there is clayey soil in the area where you're planning to put the mason bee house. Uplift it with a shovel to make it a little more friable so that the bee can obtain small amounts and carry to her nest. If you have no mud visible, then the mason bee will have no working material with which to build her nest. If you're concerned that the yard lacks for clay-like soil, then dig some small holes with a shovel and look for clay-like soil somewhere else, possibly in a neighbor's yard or possibly along a stream bed, and then bring this mud-like soil back to the small holes that you've dug and keep them moist during the pollinating season. The lack of clay-like mud is the #1 reason for the failure of mason bees to nest. And if the mason bee cannot find this type of soil within 50 to 100 feet of the nest, then she will move elsewhere to build her nest and rear her young. And if the mud dries out mid-season, she will leave. So it's very important to identify mud. You remember the mud pies that we made as children? This is the kind of mud we're talking about. No gravel or sand or bark, but real good stick in your hand mud. Now, the third essential for mason bee to thrive is the mason bee house. There's a wide range of designs. You can be a do-it-yourselfer or you can buy a mason bee house. We have some examples on a slide that will give you some photos to look at for the mason bee housing. The house needs to be durable and weather resistant. It can be made of wood, or you might use a 4-inch diameter T pipe which is about 10 centimeters in diameter. Or you could use something as simple as a rolled oats container that's wrapped in several layers of duct tape as a mason bee house. There are different types of materials that you can use, but the important thing is that the mason bee house is durable, weathered, so that the contents of the house remain dry. That's the important thing. There should be a roof overhanging 4 to 6 inches beyond where the tubes or the nesting tray will be to provide for wind and rain protection. Now you want to plan to have a space inside the house. If you look at these photos, you'll notice that the house on the left has an attic, and you'll notice the house on the right has a small box that's attached to the bottom. In both of those cases, that's a space where the cocoons can be placed prior to their emergence. So it's a release platform, or in the case of the small box, it's a release box. Once the mason bee house has been set up, you want to leave it where it is, attached, and not to move it during the pollinating season. This mason bee house should allow for the removal of the tubes or the trays at the end of the season. For a small urban garden, one house that holds between 30 to 40 tubes or tunnels in a nesting tray is adequate nesting space. For a large natural area or large garden with 15 or more blooming trees, a larger house that would hold up to 100 tubes or tunnels is recommended. The location is important for your mason bee house. You want to think about where to position it. You want to attach it firmly to a structure, to a wall or a fence, where it will get the warmth of the early morning sunlight. Opening toward the south or the southeast or the east is best. You want to keep the house out of direct rain. A porch might work, or a balcony with an overhanging eave, a post in the ground where the bee house can be attached, possibly a little roof. As you see the photo on the left, the person who made this mason bee house created a little A-frame sort of roof over the house. Anything to keep the contents dry, that's important. You want to walk around the garden, and in the morning when the morning light is look for a place, a sunny wall, where you might attach the house, or where you might place a post and then attach a mason bee house to that post. Make sure to look for pollen and nectar sources within the 300 feet of where the house will be. That would be 90 meters. And look for that clayey soil. Mount the house about head height so that you can enjoy watching the bee activity. Back to the clayey mud, when I mentioned the importance of having that nearby, we're not talking about a lot of mud. We're talking about taking a shovel in your own area, in your own garden, digging a hole of maybe 1 or 2 holes near to the house. And you can also sometimes scrape away the mulch or the bark chips, digging into the native soil, and you'll find that you have clay-like soil right where you are. The fourth essential to the survival of the mason bee colony are the nesting materials. Nesting materials come in 2 basic types. There are the tubes, which are paper tubes. I like to use a cardboard tube that's called a guard tube, and then a paper liner tube. The guard tubes, in my case, are going on about 10 years of use. The liner tube is used once for just that season, and then I open when I open and clean and harvest. You can purchase bee tubes with inserts in quantity from local suppliers or online. Another type of nesting material are tunnels, nesting trays that come apart. They can be made of wood or of a corn substance, and these nesting trays can be opened for harvest and cleaning at the end of the season. What you want to avoid using are blocks of wood that have been drilled with holes, or bamboo, because both the blocks of wood and the bamboo tubes are nearly impossible to open for cleaning, and both types of housing harbor predatory mites that destroy mason bee larvae. In the middle photo of this slide, notice there's a release box attached to the bottom of the mason bee house. Release box is a small box. You can take a small box. You can take a matchbox, create a hole that's about the diameter of a tube or a tunnel opening, and then attach that to the bottom of the mason bee house, or put it in the attic, or slip it in on top of the tubes of the mason bee house. Back to the do-it-yourselfer for the Quaker Oats, you'll notice the tubes have been stuffed into this box, and then sticks have been added so that it's pretty firm and isn't going to fall out, and that's the important thing. We'll have time for questions and answers about this afterwards. The 4 essentials then, what we've quickly touched on, are the blooming plants, the mud, the house, and the nesting materials. We have a Mason beekeeper's calendar, but let me first show you that we have a short video. This was taken at a Mason bee habitat that I set up last, and those mason bees coming and go during, I believe this was in mid-April when I shot this short footage. You may have noticed that there was mud on the front ends of many of the tubes. That tells you that the mason bee female had built her nest, had laid the eggs, and then had mudded over the front of the tube to protect those eggs as they were then going through their development. A beekeeper's calendar is helpful. It shows us how the males emerge in March and early April, then followed by the females. The lifespan of the male lasts only about 2 weeks. That's during some early pollination and mating time. And then the male's lifespan ends. The females go on for 6 to 8 weeks of pollination work, pollinating and the eggs. And then the eggs are in the mud chambers, and they go through their metamorphosis over a period of about a month and a half, until a fully adult formed bee has spun its cocoon and then rests in that chamber for several months before emerging the following spring. When should you set out your mason bee cocoons, and how many cocoons to put into the house? The one good way to count the number of cocoons that you could use would be to count the number of tubes or the number of holes in the nesting trays that you have, then put that number of cocoons out. And when to set the cocoons out, I would say it's a good idea to set the cocoons outdoors when you first see blossoms opening, when the outdoor air temperature in the Willamette Valley and Western Oregon and Western Washington is is fluctuating between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 10 to 13 Celsius. Blossoms are opening up. Temperature is consistently rising to that range. You put the cocoons inside a small release box or in the attic of a mason bee house. If you already have cocoons and you're waiting for that time, you can place them in the refrigerator, keeping them refrigerated at a constant 34 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 to 3 Celsius. And if you do put the cocoons in the refrigerator for storage, you want to make sure that you create a storage box, if you will, something that you can place some holes in it, some damp paper toweling or cotton balls. You want to create a humidified kind of space. And I happen to be near my refrigerator, and I'll show you one of those here in a few minutes. If there are no blooms open within a 300-foot range of the mason bee house, then keep the cocoons in the refrigerator until you notice trees and shrubs in that vicinity beginning to open up. There are crucial times in the life of a mason bee where they are more vulnerable for predation. And I wanted to speak to one of those and to help give you a remedy for protecting the mason bees. The female bee will be pollinating those plants for 6 to 8 weeks, during which time she is laying the eggs and placing them in the mud chambers. By about the first week of June in Western Oregon and Western Washington, the bees will have finished their pollinating and their life cycle has ended. At this point, the mason bee house is vulnerable because there are not bees coming and going from the house. So when you notice that the activity of the bees has stopped coming and going from the house, it's important that you do something to protect the mason bee house from a predatory parasitic wasp that seems to be common in the region, the Monodomptomerus wasp. For shorthand, we call it the mono wasp, a very tiny wasp. You practically need a magnifier to be able to identify it. And the way to protect the bees, because what will happen is the wasp flies into the house and then lays its eggs through the ovipositor, deposits its eggs into the emerging larva of the mason bee by penetrating the mason bee tube and the mud. So there are two quick remedies. I'll show them to you. About the first week of June, take nylon stocking material. Gentlemen, ask a woman in your life for a pair of nylon knee-high or an old pair of pantyhose, if anyone still wears them, and stretch that over the front of the mason bee house. That will protect from the Monodomptomerus wasp getting into the house. And then in the mason bee world, there is actually a very nice and large, I'll hold it up if you can see it, mesh bag. And this would hold 3 or 4 mason bee houses, or 3 or 4, the contents of 3 or 4 mason bee houses. You can stretch this around the mason bee house and attach it at the back securely, or you can, if you wish, remove the mason bee tubes and the trays as of about the first week of June, when you see no more bee activity. Place them into this mesh bag, and you can put this in a dark, dry space where it will continue to benefit from the warmth of the summer season, but will be out of the reach of the predatory parasitic wasps. Finally, any responsible mason bee host should, in my opinion, know about and practice cleaning of mason bees, because cleaning of the mason bee colony is crucial to the health of the mason bees from one year to the next. In my first experience with mason bees, my housemate and I had mason bees of 8 generations in the same house, in the same location. Now, having moved to a new location in the last couple of years, mason bees in our yard are now coming on to their 3rd generation. I'm sure it is because of the care and cleaning that we have followed. So here's a simple way to remember how to clean the mason bees. Between October and December, or you might think of it as between Halloween and Hanukkah, open the mason bee tubes or tunnels, examine the cocoons and clean them, and then store them for winter. This process will take you about 2 hours per year for a mason bee colony of 30 to 40 tubes or trays. When opening the tubes or the trays, you want to examine each cocoon. You can hold them in your hand this time of year, especially when they're in diapause, which would be November and December. They will not emerge, even if you bring them into your house for a couple of hours, and then return them to an unheated space. Examine each cocoon. It should resemble a fuzzy plump raisin, kind of what it looked like when you first met your mason bees this spring. Females are larger than the males. Now you want to look for orange spots. That would be a sign of the pollen mites have gotten into the colony, which is very common. The orange dots are not the pollen mites themselves, but the orange dots are the pollen mites frass, or poop. The pollen mites are clear and only visible with a magnifier. But if you see the orange dots, you know that there are pollen mites in your colony. Also, you look for a tiny hole in a cocoon that's visible with the naked eye. And you want to remove those cocoons because unfortunately they have been invaded by that parasitic wasp. I recommend cleaning cocoons with water that has a diluted bleach solution, 2 tablespoons of household bleach to 1 gallon of water. That would be 30 milliliters of household bleach to a gallon of water. After using the water and bleach solution, then re-examine the cocoons to see that they are clean and rinse them with clear water, and then lay the cocoons on blotting paper to dry. You can save metal tea tins or some type of container. You make holes in the base and the lid of this, and these tins are good for storage in unheated, dry, dark shed or garage during the winter months. About refrigeration, let me show you how to do that. In the refrigerator, you can create a humidifier, a little humidity container. These are available for purchase, or you can use something from a takeout food that we have a lot of these days. Placing damp paper toweling, some cotton balls that you've gotten wet and then squeezed out the excess moisture, holes for air to escape and enter, placing this in the refrigerator at a constant 34 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit is another way to store mason bees. I mostly store mason bees in an unheated shed through the months and in these little containers that have air holes, and that seems to be just fine. So to responsibly host mason bees, it takes a few hours of work in the spring and the fall of each year, but the increase of flowers and of fruits and the satisfaction of strengthening the population of these native bees is very worthwhile. We have some good resources available locally for you to acquire supplies and cocoons to get started. We'll be sharing this information after the workshop. And there is a brochure that you can download that is provided by Metro. It is published by oregonmetro.gov/native plants that helps with identifying native plants for Willamette Valley gardens, which would apply to Western Oregon and Western Washington gardens. But as I said, we'll be sharing these resources out with you following the workshop. We have time for questions and hope that we can help answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. That was great. Before we get into the Q&A section of the event this morning, I just want to take a second and thank Backyard Bird Shop. They were very generous and supportive of our event today and donated a Mason bee starter kit, which we will be entering everyone on today's event into a drawing to win that. And we will be in touch with you this coming week in getting this to the winner. So Backyard Bird Shop has locations in Vancouver, Portland, on Fremont, Beaverton, Westland, and Lake Oswego. So they're a great resource for getting any and all of your Mason bee supplies. All right, so we've already got a lot of questions. So I'm gonna go ahead and start and just probably direct, a lot of these are in regards to Mason bees. So Janet, you mentioned that the risks with hosting Mason bees are low. Are there any risks? And if so, can you kind of describe that?
Sure, that's a very good question. The male Mason bee does not have a stinger. His body is not created to have a stinger. The female does have that capability, but she would only use it if she were under immediate direct physical threat, such as if a person were trying to squeeze her to death in the palm of their hand. And if rarely a Mason bee should sting, it would feel something like mosquito bite. So when I say the risks are low, you can be at close range with Mason bees. You can be inches away enjoying their activities, coming out of and going back into the Mason bee house, and they're not at all interested in you. Their interest is in pollination and in the preparing of the nest for the young. So that's what I meant when I said the risks are very low.
Thank you. So we have another question here. We have had Mason bees for several years. Each year, we are unsure how to trade out the tubes where they nest. They want to use the old tubes and have trouble adapting to the new and clean tubes. Do you have any advice on that?
Cleaning the tubes is important. So you want to have a Mason bee house with nesting materials that's set up in such a way that you can actually clean the tubes and remove the cocoons from those tubes. If you have a previously established Mason bee nesting habitat that is such as holes drilled into a wood block, those are best to retire each year and to start with fresh. So there's a handy way that you can take a wood block that is mudded over and has Mason bees inside of it, and still allow the bees to emerge, and then just take away that wood block so they don't go back in the next season. The way to do that is I'll pretend that I'm holding a wood block right here. I'll pretend this is not a tray that can be opened, but a wood block with holes. I take it, it's mudded over. I put it in a vertical position. Since Mason bees come and go on the horizontal plane, but they will emerge if it's on a vertical plane. I put it in a paper sack with a hole toward the sky. And I place that near to the new Mason bee house where the fresh tubes or nesting tray are located. As the Mason bees emerge from the old habitat, they come out vertically, they look to the sky, they're out, they're emerging, they start their pollination. And once I notice that the tubes have opened up and that has occurred, then I take away the old habitat because they won't go back down into a paper bag. Now you may have a different kind of situation and we can address that individually after the workshop if that helps. But basically, Mason bees, in order to survive, in order to thrive from one year to the next, and that's your objective. You're not doing this as a one-year activity, but you hope to have Mason bees living in the garden over many years. You want to clean the cocoons in the fall. If you haven't done that this year, and you do have Mason bees right now, wait and see how many emerge and put up some fresh tubes And that way you should be encouraging them to go into fresh tubes. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions related to the natural cleaning process. And if there is a natural cleaning process when they are left alone, or like, can you speak to the importance of interfering and cleaning them by humans versus just letting them do their own thing naturally?
There are two ways that humans can help to manage mason bee colonies to keep the mason bee colonies clean from the mites and from the parasitic wasps. The one that I discussed has to do with the water bath. The other is using mason sand, in which you open the tubes and you place the cocoons into a jar of mason sand and then do a shake, shake, shake. And that helps to take away those mites. But if you're talking about a natural cleaning method, the challenge that we face in having mason bee houses in urban areas or in suburban or rural areas is that mason bees are nesting from the back of a tube to the front of a tube. The female is laying the female eggs toward the back of the tube, and then she's laying the male eggs toward the front of the tube. If cocoon number 3 in the line happens to have been killed during the hibernation season by the mites, by the wasp, then that is not going to emerge. Therefore, bees numbers 1 and 2 will emerge, but then 3 is dead, so 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 will never be able to emerge. They will die. So in terms of that process, that's pretty unsatisfactory, in my opinion, for the mason bee survival. So what we're trying to do here is to encourage the survival of more mason bees so that we can strengthen their population.
And that's really interesting and helpful. And I had similar questions, what people had wrote in, thinking about what are we trying to replicate from nature in creating these? And I think you partially answered it there, and that it seems like an important thing to think about is that in a natural environment where there hasn't been the introduction of buildings and pavement and loss of mud, that mason bees could do this work on their own. But right now their populations are so diminished that we're trying to boost their numbers to hopefully get back to a place where mason bees are nesting without the aid of people, but we're maybe a long way off from that. Does that all sound right?
Yes, that's a good way to describe it, Dan, because in nature, mason bees are much more distributed or much more dispersed out in nature. And they used to be the main pollinators for our region prior to the immigration by Europeans to our region and the importing of the European honeybees. But they're so diminished now. What we're trying to do is, as you say, replenish the population of them.
That's great, thank you. So we have someone here, they have not opened their bee houses and cleaned them and the cocoons yet this year. Is it too late to do so?
Yes, that's a very good question. And the simple answer is yes, it's too late to do that. So you just let nature take its course now, because we are within 30 days, I would suggest, of the emergence of mason bees. They've been under some stress for several months in the sense that they're living off food stores. They haven't eaten or had any nourishment since last late spring, early summer. So it's better to let, at this point, this late in the season, just let the mason bees emerge as they will. And if you're concerned that there might be some lack of survival rate going on, possibly you could put another mason bee house close to the existing one so that you give them some new clean quarters.
Thank you. So kind of looking at the mason bee homes themselves, what's the recommended diameter for the tubes that they are in?
Very good question, because a lot of people like to make their own habitat, but the tube diameter should be 5/16 of an inch and should be uniformly that. That would be 8 millimeter diameter. That's the diameter of the tubes that you can purchase, such as through Crown Bees or Bee Diverse in the Pacific Northwest, Washington and British Columbia, respectively. That would be the diameter of the nesting trays that are available as well. It's the 8 millimeter, 5/16 of an inch. That's for the spring orchard bee, the mason bee that we're talking about.
Thank you.
If you're going to use a router, by the way, Tanya, I wanted to add, if you're going to use a router and build your own, you want to make sure that what you're doing is making a very smooth interior to the tunnel or the tube for the mason bee, because that's what she's attracted to in terms of nesting. And she'll start at the back of the tube, laying in a pollen and nectar ball, and then an egg, and then put a mud plug, and she'll repeat that process from the rear of the tube or tunnel out to the, and you'll have in a 6 to 8 inch length tube or tunnel, you'll have about, we'll say 6 to 10 mason bee eggs, each nestled into a separate little mud chamber with a mud plug. And then at the front of the tube, she'll place a thicker mud plug to protect against predators.
Thank you. That's great. We have a lot of questions about flies and different kinds of flies bothering mason bee homes. Do you have recommendations for how to keep the flies away? Are there any safe fly traps, or do you have any recommendations there?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, I'm glad that the person asking those questions did raise that question, because a lot of people think that mason bees are what they think are house flies are actually mason bees. And a mason bee is a real bee that sometimes people mistake for a house fly. In my experience of hosting mason bees for 11 years, I have never seen flies around mason bee houses. Flies are attracted to, well, we know what flies are attracted to. Flies are attracted to things that are rotting. Flies are attracted to basura, to waste products. And so it would be my first experience if I ever were to see flies around a mason bee house. I've just never seen that before. I'm sorry that I can't be of greater help on that question. So that's what I have to say about that. Good luck with that. I guess if that's in fact a fly that's bothering a mason bee house, then I would think there might be something else in the vicinity that's attracting that fly. It's not the mason bees. It's not the mason bee mud or pollen or nectar. There should be no flies around mason bee houses in their natural environment.
Makes sense. Thank you. So we also have a lot of questions about mason bees' relationship with honeybees, and if it's an issue to have a mason bee home near a honeybee home. Do you have any insight on that?
That's a very good question. Mason bees and honeybees peacefully coexist. Mason bees, in fact, peacefully coexist with all other bees. There are about 600 species of native bees in Oregon, as according to the research being conducted by Oregon State University. And we have the honeybees that are the imports from Europe. They all seem to peacefully coexist. I would say there's one thing that's important about where you place a mason bee house. That would be, do not place it near a birdhouse. You want to place a mason bee house distinctly away from where there would be birds nesting. They need their own space in that regard.
What about leaf cutter bees? We have one question here where someone found a number of leaf cutter bees intermingled with mason bees. Do they interact at all? And is there anything to do to
That's
avoid
great.
this?
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a great discovery. Leaf cutter bees, which instead of gathering mud, they gather leaf material, they chew it up, and then they create a nesting habitat with the leaf matter. They prefer a smaller diameter tube. They prefer not to use a mason bee tube, but I suppose they will if that's all they can find. So for the leaf cutter bee host who sent in that question, you can buy leaf cutter bee sized tubes, and they do emerge later than the mason bees. So there are a couple things you can do. One thing you can do is put the mason bee tubes out and enjoy hosting the mason bees. And then toward the end of May or early June, remove those mason bee tubes that should at this point be mudded over and put them in a secure, dark, unheated space for them to continue to develop. And then put the leafcutter bee tubes out in the same house. And the leafcutter bees, which emerge more and they emerge more around May and June and are more active in the summer months, since they have different food sources.
Great, thank you. We also have a lot of questions regarding the natural nests that are natural homes that mason bees might find. A lot of folks are noticing mason bees in their yards, but don't have houses put out. So can you talk a little bit about where these bees may nest naturally?
Sure. In nature, mason bees will find nesting habitat in tunnels that have been previously excavated by insects. In our garden, I'm pretty sure I see evidence of mason bees hosting nesting in some tunnels that were pecked out by a woodpecker on the trees in the garden where we live. Around the house, mason bees will find places to nest in nail or screw holes that are around doors or around windows. They like to get in behind shingles. They like to get in behind siding, like cedar siding, and they'll create tunnels behind cedar siding in homes. There's lots of places mason bees are looking for. Some place that's a little previously excavated tunnel. That's what they like to do. And as in nature, they'll be much more dispersed in that regard, if that's, where they find a place to nest.
That makes sense. Thank you. So we have questions regarding the types of house and placement. So I think I'll just get to a couple of those. A lot of our questions today are so great, and they're really specific to individual folks' situations. So I think a lot of these questions are going to be great to record and have Janet, you weigh in with your expertise so we can share these answers out afterwards. But I think I'll just do a few more questions here. And one of our questions is in regards to the mason bee homes that you purchase. So the experience is having these homes warp and fall apart during the winter. Are there any recommendations, or are there any, what are your preferred materials for mason bee homes?
Okay, good question. First of all, if possible, the mason bee homes will last the longest if you can keep them out of direct rain, so that they're not being rained upon in the maritime Northwest, or recently being snowed upon in the maritime Northwest. That's one thing to consider if you want the house to last a long, long time. The current houses that I have are in their 11th year of hosting mason bees. And they're made of, I purchased both of them. They're made of cedar, I believe, and made locally in the region. The mason bee house that I made out of the Quaker Oats tube, I always make sure to keep it out of a rainy, like keep it under an eave. And it's going on its, I think it's 4th year because of lots of duct tape around it. And I put a plastic flower pot that I took the bottom out of, and you don't see it here, but I put that on as a collar, if you will, so that there's that 4 to 6 inch overhang for the tubes. You can also replace a mason bee house after several years. There's no reason not to. You do want to make sure that when you clean a mason bee house that you do not use bleach on a mason bee house. You want to make sure that you only use a little brush or some water, because mason bees do have a strong sense of smell, and they do like to, they're attracted to the aroma of the mud, the pollen, and the nectar of the home. I hope that's somewhat helpful, but we can give more specifics when we dig into the individual questions after the workshop. That's great.
What about human interaction? Is it better to place your homes away where there's going to be less foot traffic, or is putting them by a shed where you might be entering in and out something that they tolerate okay?
The mason bees don't seem to mind human interaction. You can stand right in front of the mason bee house and they won't seem to pay any attention to you. And placing the house at eye level is really a lot of fun and rather meditative. It's one of the fun aspects of gardening, I would say. I know one man put his mason bee house up so high that he had to climb a ladder to enjoy the view of the mason bees flying out and flying in. And one day he almost fell off his ladder. And so he realized that he better put it down more at eye level.
Well, this is great. I know we have so many great questions, and I feel like we could honestly continue for another hour with these, but I think for the sake of time, and just because so many of these questions are particular to folks, very specific circumstances in their own yard, I think that is all that we'll get to today. So I just want to take a moment and thank everyone again for joining us this morning and starting your weekend with us to learn a little bit more about Columbia Land Trust, our backyard habitat program, and native pollinators. Really thank you to Janet and to Dan for lending your expertise today, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much. If you're inspired by the work that you saw today, like the Backyard Habitat Program, those types of programs are really made possible because of people like you. We would encourage you to check out our website, columbialandtrust.org. And if you're interested in supporting our work, you can make a gift today at columbialandtrust.org/donate. Our next virtual event is coming up on March 13th, Saturday morning, 9 a.m. And it is Places of Pika. We'll be learning all about those fuzzy little creatures that live in the Columbia River Gorge and are an excellent example of the resilience of the natural world. So details and to register, visit our website, and continue to check out our social media for additional events in the coming year. Thank you again, everybody. And thanks again, Janet and Dan.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tanya and Janet. Yeah, it's always great to hear you. Yeah, it's always great to hear you talk about mason bees. It's really fun.
Rock on mason bees.
Yes, thank you so much.